Doctor. Jonathan Mitchell's hand froze mid-examination, his stethoscope slipping from trembling fingers as he stared at the golf ball-sized mass protruding from Dorothy Sullivan's neck. This wasn't the simple sebaceous cyst the 77-year-old retired nurse had dismissed for 3 decades. "Sweet Jesus," whispered the emergency room nurse, her face draining of color as she backed toward the door. The heart monitor's steady beeping suddenly seemed deafeningly loud in the suffocating silence that followed Mitchell's sharp intake of breath. Dorothy's weathered hand instinctively moved to cover the grotesque bulge, the same protective gesture she'd made countless times over 30 years while convincing herself it was harmless. But the terror in her granddaughter Emma's eyes, those same green eyes that had once looked at her with such trust, told a different story. "Get Dr. Harrison on the phone." "Now," Mitchell commanded, though his voice barely concealed the tremor of uncertainty that had crept in. "And clear my schedule for the rest of the week." What had this brave woman been carrying all these years? And how much time did they have left? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months before that terrifying moment in the emergency room, Dorothy Mae Sullivan sat in her favorite rocking chair on the wraparound porch of the modest farmhouse she'd called home for 52 years. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the weathered floorboards where Harold used to prop his work boots every evening after his shift at the chemical plant. Now, only Dorothy's worn slippers marked the passage of time. At 77, Dorothy possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from 5 decades of nursing at Mercy General Hospital. Her steel-gray hair was always perfectly pinned, her posture ramrod straight despite the years of bending over hospital beds and comforting the dying. The townspeople of Millbrook, Ohio, still called her Nurse Dorothy, though she'd retired 7 years ago after Harold's funeral. Some habits, like some people, were too deeply rooted to change. The mass on her neck had been her silent companion for 30 years now. She'd first noticed it as a small bump during the Reagan administration, dismissing it as an occupational hazard of hospital life. "Probably picked up some bug from a patient," she'd told Harold, who'd frowned with the worried expression of a man who'd spent his life around dangerous chemicals and understood the weight of ignoring warning signs. But Dorothy was nothing if not practical. She'd delivered babies in hospital hallways, held the hands of the dying at 3 in the morning, and once talked a suicidal teenager off the hospital roof using nothing but her grandmother's apple pie recipe and infinite patience. A little bump on her neck seemed insignificant compared to the real battles she'd fought. Over the decades, as the bump grew from pea size to walnut size to its current golf ball dimensions, Dorothy had adapted with the same methodical precision she'd used to organize hospital supply closets. She learned to position herself at certain angles during conversations, wore high-necked blouses, and developed an unconscious habit of covering the area with her hand whenever she laughed too hard or sneezed. The financial reality of her situation made doctor visits feel like luxury she couldn't afford. Harold's medical bills from his final illness had drained their savings, and her modest nursing pension barely covered the mortgage payments on the house they'd bought as newlyweds. She'd convinced herself that her nursing knowledge was sufficient. Sebaceous cysts were common, benign, and generally harmless unless they became infected. What Dorothy hadn't anticipated was the guilt that would consume her granddaughter Emma, the brilliant family physician who lived 4 hours away in Chicago. Emma called every Sunday at precisely 2 o'clock, their conversations following the same comfortable pattern: weather, church gossip, updates on Emma's demanding practice, and careful omissions about Dorothy's growing loneliness. Dorothy had raised Emma after her parents died in a car accident when the girl was 12. She'd sacrificed her own dreams of traveling with Harold to ensure Emma had every opportunity for success. Now, watching her granddaughter's career flourish from a distance, Dorothy felt both immense pride and an aching emptiness that no amount of community casseroles or church visits could fill. The mass had become her secret burden, a physical manifestation of all the things she'd learned to carry alone. Emma Grace Sullivan hadn't planned to surprise her grandmother for her 77th birthday. Her practice in Chicago was overwhelmed with flu season, her divorce papers were still scattered across her kitchen table awaiting signatures, and the 4-hour drive to Millbrook felt like an insurmountable obstacle after another 18-hour day at the clinic. But guilt had a way of making decisions for her. She'd missed Dorothy's last 3 birthdays, each absence justified by medical emergencies that seemed to multiply whenever family obligations loomed. This time, standing in her empty apartment at midnight, surrounded by takeout containers and case files, Emma realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard genuine joy in her grandmother's voice during their Sunday calls. The drive through rural Ohio gave Emma time to rehearse apologies she'd been crafting for months. She'd brought Dorothy's favorite chocolates from a boutique shop in Lincoln Park and a cashmere shawl she hoped would soften the edges of her chronic absence. What she hadn't prepared for was the shock of seeing her grandmother's diminished frame when Dorothy opened the front door. "Emma Grace, sweet Lord, what are you doing here?" Dorothy's face lit up with the kind of pure happiness that made Emma's chest tighten with regret. The embrace that followed nearly knocked the wind out of both women. That's when Emma felt it. The mass pressed against her collarbone during their hug, hard and unmistakable beneath Dorothy's cotton blouse. Emma's medical training kicked in automatically, her fingers instinctively probing the area even as Dorothy pulled away with a laugh that sounded forced. "Grandma, what is this?" Emma's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to diagnosing problems others preferred to ignore. "Oh, that old thing?" Dorothy waved dismissively, already moving toward the kitchen where she'd left birthday cake batter half mixed in her favorite ceramic bowl. "Just a little sebaceous cyst. Had it for years. Nothing to fuss about." But Emma wasn't so easily deterred. Her residency in internal medicine had taught her to recognize when patients minimized symptoms, and the size of what she'd felt made her stomach clench with alarm. "Grandma, that's not little. That's the size of a golf ball." "Don't be dramatic, honey. I've been a nurse longer than you've been breathing. I know what I'm dealing with." Dorothy's tone carried the gentle firmness she'd used to settle arguments between Emma and her childhood friends. But this wasn't about borrowed toys or hurt feelings. "When was the last time you had it examined?" Emma followed her grandmother into the kitchen, noting how Dorothy instinctively positioned herself to keep the mass on her far side, a defensive maneuver that spoke of years of practice. Dr. Henley looked at it maybe 5-6 years ago, said it was nothing to worry about unless it got infected. Dorothy began whisking cake batter with more vigor than necessary, avoiding Emma's increasingly concerned gaze. Emma felt her professional instincts colliding with family dynamics in the most uncomfortable way. She'd spent years learning to balance compassion with clinical objectivity, but watching her beloved grandmother dismiss what could be a serious medical condition made her feel like a helpless child again. "Grandma, cysts don't typically get that large without cause for concern. The location, the size, the fact that it's been growing." "Growing?" Dorothy's whisking stopped abruptly. "Who said anything about growing?" The slip was telling. Emma recognized the moment when a patient realized they'd revealed more than intended. "It has been growing, hasn't it? That's why you've been wearing high necklines in all the photos you send." Dorothy set down the whisk and turned to face her granddaughter fully. At 77, she still possessed the kind of quiet dignity that had made frightened patients feel safe, but Emma could see cracks in the facade now. "Emma Grace, I've handled worse things than a little bump on my neck. Remember when Mrs. Patterson came in with that compound fracture, bone sticking right through her? This isn't about other people, Grandma. This is about you." Emma's voice cracked slightly. "Why haven't you had it properly examined? What aren't you telling me?" The silence stretched between them. punctuated only by the old kitchen clock's steady ticking and the distant sound of neighbors mowing lawns. Dorothy's hands, still strong despite their age spots, gripped the counter edge. "Because I'm scared," Dorothy finally whispered, the admission seeming to surprise even her. "And because I can't afford to be sick right now. This house, Harold's medical bills, my medications. Emma, honey, I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Emma realized that while she'd been building her practice and establishing her independence, her grandmother had been drowning quietly, too proud to ask for help and too practical to seek medical care she couldn't afford. "We're calling Dr. Mitchell first thing Monday morning," Emma said, her voice carrying the finality of a medical directive. "And I'm staying until we figure this out." Dr. Jonathan Mitchell had seen nearly everything in his 25 years as chief of dermatology at University Hospital. But the woman sitting across from his desk Monday morning presented something that made him pause mid-sentence while reviewing her intake form. Dorothy Sullivan, 77 years old, retired nurse, accompanied by her granddaughter, Dr. Emma Sullivan, had been referred for evaluation of a long-standing neck mass. The clinical language didn't prepare him for the reality of Dorothy's condition. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you've had this growth for approximately 30 years. Mitchell kept his voice professionally neutral while his mind raced through differential diagnoses. The mass was clearly visible even with Dorothy's strategic positioning, distorting the natural line of her neck in a way that suggested significant size and deep tissue involvement. "That's right, doctor. Started as just a little bump back in the early 90s. Never gave me much trouble, so I figured it was best left alone." Dorothy's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to enduring discomfort without complaint, but Mitchell noticed how her hand unconsciously moved to cover the area whenever she spoke. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair beside her grandmother. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm a family physician in Chicago, and I have to say the size and characteristics of this mass are concerning. The surface appears vascularized, it's firm to palpation, and my grandmother admits it's been slowly enlarging over the past several years." Mitchell nodded, appreciating the clinical precision of Emma's observations while noting the underlying tension in her voice. Family members in the medical field often struggled with the dual role of loved one and healthcare provider, and he could see the strain in Emma's carefully controlled expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to perform a thorough examination now, if that's acceptable to you." "Dr. Sullivan, you're welcome to stay or step out, whatever makes your grandmother most comfortable." "I'll stay," Dorothy said quickly, reaching for Emma's hand. "This girl's seen me through worse scrapes than this." The examination revealed what Mitchell had suspected from across the room but hoped he was wrong about. The mass, measured approximately 4 centimeters in diameter, was fixed to underlying tissues and displayed the kind of vascularity that suggested either long-term inflammation or something more concerning. The overlying skin showed signs of chronic irritation, with areas of hyperpigmentation and what appeared to be early ulceration at one margin. Most troubling was the mass's location and its relationship to surrounding anatomical structures. It seemed to involve not just the superficial tissues but potentially deeper structures as well, including what might be lymphatic or even neural involvement. The texture was unlike any sebaceous cyst Mitchell had encountered in his career. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be honest with you both. This doesn't present like a typical sebaceous cyst. The size, location, vascularity, and tissue characteristics are unusual enough that I'm recommending immediate biopsy and advanced imaging studies." Dorothy's facade of calm began to crack slightly. "What exactly are you thinking it might be, doctor?" Mitchell chose his words carefully, aware that both women possessed medical knowledge that would make sugarcoating counterproductive. There are several possibilities we need to rule out. Given the long-standing nature and recent changes, we're looking at everything from atypical cystic lesions to more concerning pathology. The biopsy will give us definitive answers. Emma's grip on her grandmother's hand tightened. What's your clinical impression based on the examination? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with professional courtesy and family anxiety. Mitchell had learned over the years that being direct with medical colleagues, even when they were family members, was usually the kindest approach. My primary concern is the possibility of a rare tumor type, possibly originating from neural or vascular structures. The long-standing nature actually works in our favor in some ways. Truly aggressive pathology rarely remains stable for decades. But the recent growth pattern and tissue characteristics warrant immediate investigation. Dorothy absorbed this information with the stoicism of someone who delivered similar news to countless families over her nursing career. How soon can we do this biopsy? I can schedule you for this Thursday. We'll do the procedure here in the office under local anesthesia, and I'll send samples to our pathologist and to a specialist at Mayo Clinic who has expertise in unusual soft tissue lesions. Mitchell began making notes in Dorothy's chart, his pen moving with practiced efficiency. And the imaging studies? Emma asked, her physician's mind already calculating timelines and potential complications. I'm ordering an MRI with contrast to map the exact extent and involvement of surrounding structures. Depending on what we find, we may need additional studies. Mitchell looked up from his notes to meet both women's eyes. I want to emphasize that while we're being thorough and appropriately cautious, many unusual presentations turn out to have benign explanations. Dorothy managed a weak smile. Doctor, I've been a nurse long enough to know that unusual presentation isn't usually followed by good news. But I appreciate your honesty. The weight of the moment settled over the small examination room. Through the window, Mitchell could see the hospital's life flight helicopter landing on the roof pad, a reminder of the urgent medical dramas that played out daily within these walls. But sometimes the most significant moments happened quietly, in the space between a patient's question and a doctor's answer. Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to know that regardless of what we find, we have excellent treatment options available. Your overall health appears good, and your medical background will be an asset in whatever treatment plan we develop. As Mitchell scheduled the necessary procedures, and Emma helped her grandmother navigate the complex web of insurance authorizations and appointment scheduling, he found himself thinking about the intersection of medical knowledge and personal fear. Dorothy Sullivan had spent 50 years caring for others facing medical uncertainty, but being the patient instead of the caregiver changed everything. The biopsy was scheduled for Thursday morning, the MRI for Wednesday afternoon. In less than a week, they would have answers that had been 30 years in the making. The week that followed Dr. Mitchell's examination stretched like an eternity, punctuated by moments of sharp anxiety. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her Chicago practice, a decision that surprised her colleagues but felt inevitable once she'd seen the worry lines deepen around her grandmother's eyes. The farmhouse that had always felt spacious now seemed to shrink around their shared tension, every creak of the old floorboards amplified by the weight of waiting. Wednesday's MRI appointment at University Hospital revealed the first glimpse of how unusual Dorothy's case truly was. The radiologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, spent an unusually long time studying the images before calling Mitchell down to the imaging department. Emma watched through the observation window as the two physicians pointed at sections of the scans, their body language suggesting confusion rather than clarity. The mass appears to have integrated with surrounding tissues in a way I've never seen before, Dr. Chen explained to Dorothy and Emma later. It's not invasive in the traditional sense, but it's somehow become incorporated into the normal anatomy. The blood supply is extensive but organized, almost like the body has adapted to accommodate it over the decades. Dorothy listened with the clinical detachment of a nurse reviewing a patient case, but Emma noticed her grandmother's hands trembling slightly as she folded and refolded the hospital gown in her lap. "Is that good or bad, doctor?" "It's unprecedented," Dr. Chen admitted. "We're going to need additional consultation to interpret these findings properly." Thursday morning's biopsy proceeded without complications, though Mitchell's expression grew increasingly puzzled as he worked. The tissue felt different under his instruments, not the consistency of typical cysts or tumors, but something that seemed almost organic in its integration with Dorothy's normal anatomy. He took multiple samples from different areas, each one presenting subtly different characteristics. "I'm sending these to 3 separate pathologists," Mitchell explained as he bandaged the biopsy sites. "One here at University Hospital, one at Cleveland Clinic, and one at Mayo. I want multiple expert opinions before we proceed." While they waited for results, Emma found herself diving into her grandmother's medical history with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a cold case. Dorothy's old nursing records, stored in cardboard boxes in the basement, painted a picture of a career spent in the most challenging areas of healthcare. She'd worked in the emergency department during the crack epidemic of the 80s, the intensive care unit during the early AIDS crisis, and the maternity ward during several disease outbreaks. But it was Harold's employment records that proved most revealing. Emma discovered that her grandfather had worked at Morrison Chemical Plant for 37 years, including during a major industrial accident in 1973. The incident, barely mentioned in local newspaper archives Emma found at the library, involved a leak in a storage tank containing experimental polymer compounds. "Grandma, tell me about the chemical spill at Harold's plant," Emma said over dinner Thursday evening, placing copies of the newspaper articles on the kitchen table. Dorothy's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "How did you find out about that?" "Research. The dates match up with when you first noticed the mass. And according to these reports, several plant employees and their family members were affected by exposure to the chemicals." Dorothy set down her fork and stared at the yellowed newspaper clippings. "I haven't thought about that in years. Harold came home that day covered in some kind of residue. They'd told the workers it was harmless, just to shower it off. But I was pregnant then, or thought I was, and I made him strip down in the garage and throw away all his clothes." Emma's breath caught. "You were pregnant?" "For about 6 weeks. Lost the baby not long after the exposure." Dorothy's voice became distant, as if she were watching the memories play out on a screen. "The doctors said these things happen, especially to women my age. I was 32, which they considered old for a first pregnancy back then. But I always wondered." The revelation hung between them like a bridge neither had known existed. Emma had always known she was adopted, but the circumstances had been explained simply. Her grandmother had been unable to have children and had opened her heart to Emma after her parents' accident. The deeper story, the loss, the potential connection to Harold's chemical exposure, the decades of wondering, had remained buried. "Did other plant families have similar problems?" Emma asked gently. "Some. Miscarriages, birth defects, unusual health problems. The company paid for medical monitoring for a while, but most people just wanted to move on with their lives. Harold and I decided not to try for children after that. We figured maybe it was God's way of telling us we were meant for something else." Friday brought the first pathology report, followed by increasingly urgent phone calls between Dr. Mitchell and colleagues across the country. Emma overheard fragments of medical terminology that made little sense when pieced together. Unique cellular architecture, adaptive tissue response, unprecedented integration patterns. By Saturday, Dorothy's case had attracted attention beyond the local medical community. Dr. Mitchell called to schedule a meeting for Monday morning, explaining that several specialists wanted to review her case in person. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want to prepare you for the fact that your case is generating significant interest in the medical community, Mitchell explained during their phone conversation. The tissue samples are showing characteristics that are challenging our understanding of how the body responds to certain types of chronic exposure. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor to the farmhouse, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, a toxicologist from the Centers for Disease Control. A tall, serious man with prematurely gray hair, he'd driven from Atlanta specifically to interview Dorothy about her experiences following the 1973 chemical exposure. Mrs. Sullivan, we've been tracking long-term health effects from various industrial incidents over the past several decades, Dr. Hawthorne explained, settling into Harold's old recliner with Dorothy's permission. Your case has come to our attention because of its unusual presentation and potential connection to the Morrison chemical incident. Dorothy served coffee in her best china, treating the CDC investigator with the same hospitality she'd shown every guest who'd ever entered her home. I'm not sure how much help I can be, Doctor. That was over 30 years ago. Actually, that's exactly what makes your case so valuable. We're seeing patterns now that weren't apparent in the immediate aftermath of these exposures. Your body's response to whatever compounds were involved appears to have been unique. Emma listened as her grandmother recounted details she'd never shared before. The strange, metallic taste that lasted for weeks after the exposure, the persistent rash that developed along her hairline, the way her hair texture changed and never returned to normal. Small details, dismissed at the time as minor inconveniences, now took on new significance when viewed through the lens of long-term chemical exposure effects. The mass on your neck, Dr. Hawthorne said carefully, according to the preliminary pathology reports, appears to contain cellular structures that suggest your body was actively trying to neutralize or sequester harmful compounds. It's as if your immune system created a specialized organ to protect the rest of your body. Dorothy absorbed this information with characteristic stoicism, but Emma could see the implications racing through her grandmother's medically trained mind. Are you saying this thing has been protecting me all these years? That's one theory we're exploring. The cellular architecture suggests active biological processes that are far more sophisticated than typical cyst formation. Your body may have developed an adaptive response that allowed you to survive exposure levels that might have been fatal to others. The weight of this possibility settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Dorothy had carried what she thought was a burden for 30 years, never imagining it might have been her salvation. Monday morning's meeting at University Hospital resembled a medical conference more than a typical patient consultation. Dr. Mitchell had assembled a team that included pathologists, toxicologists, oncologists, and researchers from 3 different institutions. Dorothy sat at the center of it all, dignified in her best dress, fielding questions about her medical history with the precision of the trained nurse she'd always been. The consensus among the pathology teams is unanimous, Dr. Mitchell announced to the assembled group. This is not a typical cyst, tumor, or any other standard pathological entity. The tissue shows evidence of highly organized cellular activity designed to isolate and neutralize foreign compounds. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a pathologist from Mayo Clinic who had flown in specifically for this meeting, added, "The implications extend far beyond Mrs. Sullivan's individual case. If we can understand the mechanisms involved, we might be able to develop treatments for other victims of chemical exposure." Emma watched her grandmother's face as the full scope of her uniqueness became clear. Dorothy had always been exceptional in Emma's eyes, but learning that her body had essentially evolved its own solution to chemical toxicity elevated her from beloved grandmother to medical marvel. "What happens now?" Dorothy asked with characteristic directness. Dr. Mitchell looked around the room at his colleagues before responding. "Mrs. Sullivan, you've become the subject of what may be the most important case study in environmental medicine in decades. With your permission, we'd like to document your case thoroughly and use it to help other people who've faced similar exposures. Dorothy considered this request with the same careful thought she'd once applied to difficult nursing decisions. Will it help other folks who got poisoned by chemicals? We believe it could help thousands of people, Dr. Vasquez replied. Your case could change how we understand and treat chemical exposure injuries. Emma felt a surge of pride mixed with protective concern. Her grandmother had already given so much of herself to helping others throughout her nursing career. Now, even in her 70s, she was being asked to contribute to medical science in a way that could benefit countless future patients. Then let's do it, Dorothy said simply. Harold always said we were put on this earth to help each other. I guess this is just another way of doing that. The transformation of Dorothy Sullivan from small-town retired nurse to medical phenomenon happened with startling rapidity. Within 48 hours of Monday's unprecedented medical conference, her case had been submitted to 3 major medical journals simultaneously, a decision that Dr. Mitchell later admitted broke every protocol he'd learned in his career, but felt absolutely necessary given the implications of Dorothy's condition. By Wednesday morning, Dorothy's quiet farmhouse had become the epicenter of a medical media storm that neither she nor Emma had anticipated. Dr. Mitchell arrived unannounced at 7 a.m., his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained excitement mixed with concern. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to prepare you for what's coming," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Dorothy offered while declining her invitation to sit down. His energy was too kinetic for sitting. "The New England Journal of Medicine wants to fast-track publication of your case study. The CDC is requesting permission to include your data in their national database of chemical exposure effects. And," he paused, running his hand through his graying hair, "60 Minutes called yesterday asking for an interview." Dorothy nearly dropped her coffee mug. "Good Lord, Doctor, I haven't even had my morning coffee yet and you're talking about television?" Emma, who had been monitoring medical news websites obsessively since Monday's meeting, wasn't entirely surprised by the media attention, but the speed of it left her breathless. "Grandma, you need to understand what's happening here. Your case isn't just medically interesting, it's revolutionary. You're living proof that the human body can adapt to chemical exposure in ways that could save thousands of lives." The next few days blurred together in a whirlwind of medical consultations, research interviews, and increasingly intrusive media requests. Dorothy's phone, which typically rang only on Sundays when Emma called, now seemed to buzz constantly with reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers who had somehow obtained her number. Emma found herself serving as an informal media gatekeeper, screening calls and protecting her grandmother from the more aggressive journalists who seemed to view Dorothy as a human interest story rather than a person deserving respect and privacy. Dr. Hawthorne from the CDC returned on Friday, this time accompanied by a full research team equipped with mobile laboratory equipment that they set up in Dorothy's living room with apologetic efficiency. The tests they conducted were more comprehensive than anything Dorothy had experienced in her decades of nursing, mapping her immune system responses, analyzing tissue samples with precision instruments, and documenting every aspect of her medical history with the thoroughness of archaeologists excavating a significant historical site. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need you to understand the broader implications of what we're seeing," Dr. Hawthorne explained as his team packed up their equipment. "The Morrison chemical incident affected approximately 300 workers and their families. Based on our follow-up studies, 87 people developed serious health complications within the first decade after exposure. 14 died from what we now believe were directly related illnesses." Dorothy absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved, her nurse's instincts recognizing the statistical significance of survival when others had perished. "And I'm the only one who developed this Adaptation? As far as we can determine, yes. Your body's response was unique, which is why it's so medically significant. Dr. Hawthorne's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent his career studying human tragedy and rarely encountered stories of triumph. You didn't just survive the exposure. You developed a biological mechanism that protected you from its effects. Emma watched her grandmother process this information, seeing decades of self-doubt and modest self-assessment being replaced by a dawning understanding of her own medical significance. Dorothy had always been a person who helped others, but she'd never imagined that her very existence might be a form of service to humanity. The weekend brought unexpected visitors in the form of 3 families from other parts of Ohio, all connected to the Morrison chemical incident through their own losses and health struggles. The Hendersons had lost a daughter to leukemia in 1985, 11 years after the father's exposure at the plant. The Martinez family had endured multiple miscarriages and birth defects that they'd never definitively linked to chemical exposure until reading about Dorothy's case in a Cleveland newspaper. The Johnsons had buried their son 2 years earlier from a rare form of liver cancer that his doctors had never been able to explain. Dorothy received these families with the same grace she'd shown grieving relatives during her nursing career. But Emma could see the emotional toll of representing hope to people who had lost so much. Her grandmother's living room became an impromptu support group, with Dorothy listening to stories of loss while grappling with her own complex feelings about being the survivor among so many casualties. "I don't understand why I was spared when so many others suffered," Dorothy confided to Emma late Saturday evening after their visitors had left. They sat together on the porch swing Harold had built 30 years earlier, the same swing where Dorothy had first noticed the small bump that had now changed her life. "It doesn't seem fair." Emma recognized the survivor's guilt that often affected patients who recovered from conditions that claimed others. "Grandma, maybe the question isn't why you survived, but what you're supposed to do with having survived. These researchers think your case could lead to treatments that prevent other people from suffering like the families we met today." The profound weight of this responsibility seemed to settle around Dorothy's shoulders like a familiar nursing cape. She had spent her career caring for others in their most vulnerable moments, and now she was being called to serve in a different but equally important way. Sunday brought Dr. Mitchell with news that would change everything. He arrived during Dorothy's usual after-church coffee time, his expression carrying the kind of barely contained excitement that Emma had learned to associate with significant medical developments. "Mrs. Sullivan, the pathology results from the Mayo Clinic team are remarkable," he said, spreading printed reports across Dorothy's kitchen table with reverent care. "The tissue samples show cellular structures that appear to be actively producing compounds that neutralize the specific chemicals you were exposed to in 1973. Your body didn't just adapt to survive the exposure, it developed ongoing protection mechanisms." Dorothy leaned forward to study the reports, her nursing training helping her decipher the medical terminology, even as the implications made her head spin. "Are you saying this thing has been working like some kind of internal medicine factory all these years?" "That's exactly what we're saying." "The mass on your neck represents one of the most sophisticated biological adaptations ever documented in response to environmental toxins. Your case is going to rewrite textbooks on environmental medicine and potentially lead to breakthrough treatments for chemical exposure victims worldwide." Emma felt the pieces of her grandmother's story clicking into place with stunning clarity. The woman who had devoted her life to healing others had become, through no choice of her own, a living laboratory for discoveries that could heal thousands more. The burden she'd carried for 30 years wasn't a medical curiosity or a source of embarrassment. It was a biological masterpiece that represented hope for people facing similar health challenges. "There's something else," Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the careful tone he used for delivering particularly significant news. Based on these findings, the National Institutes of Health wants to establish a research center specifically dedicated to studying adaptive responses to environmental toxins. They want to name it after you, Mrs. Sullivan, the Dorothy Sullivan Center for Environmental Health Research. Dorothy sat in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she contemplated the possibility of her name being associated with medical research that could span decades and potentially save countless lives. The retired nurse from Millbrook, Ohio, who had spent 30 years hiding a bump on her neck, was being offered the opportunity to have her legacy permanently intertwined with hope for others facing similar challenges. The magnitude of the moment was almost too large to comprehend, but Emma could see her grandmother's nursing instincts recognizing the opportunity to serve others in a way that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined during her bedside care days. "Harold always said everything happens for a reason," Dorothy finally whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of uncertainty transformed into purpose. "I guess he was right." The decision to proceed with surgical removal of Dorothy's mass came 3 weeks after the NIH announcement, but it arrived wrapped in complications that no one had anticipated. Dr. Mitchell's initial confidence about the procedure had been steadily eroding as additional imaging studies revealed the true extent of the mass's integration with Dorothy's cardiovascular and nervous systems. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be completely honest with you about the risks we're facing," Dr. Mitchell said, during what Emma had hoped would be their final pre-surgical consultation. The conference room at University Hospital felt sterile and cold, despite the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and Emma noticed her grandmother's hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "The mass has become so integrated with your carotid artery and the nerve pathways in your neck that removal carries significant risks of stroke, permanent nerve damage, or worse." Mitchell's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights reviewing surgical options and finding none of them acceptable. "At your age, and given the complexity of the procedure, I have to tell you that the surgery itself could be fatal." Dorothy absorbed this information with the stoic expression she'd perfected during 50 years of delivering difficult news to patients' families, but Emma felt her world tilting on its axis. After weeks of viewing her grandmother as a medical miracle, the sudden confrontation with mortality felt like a betrayal of everything they'd learned to hope for. "What are the odds, doctor?" Dorothy asked, with characteristic directness. Mitchell consulted his notes, though Emma suspected he had the statistics memorized. "Given your age and the surgical complexity, we're looking at approximately a 40% chance of serious complications, including a 20% chance of fatality during or immediately after the procedure." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Emma found herself calculating probabilities with the cold precision of her medical training, while simultaneously grappling with the emotional reality of potentially losing the woman who had raised her, guided her, and now inspired her in ways she was only beginning to understand. "And if I don't have the surgery?" Dorothy's question carried no fear, only the practical curiosity of someone accustomed to weighing medical options. "The mass continues to grow slowly but measurably. Based on current progression rates, it will likely begin to compromise your breathing and swallowing within 6 to 12 months. The end would be—" Mitchell paused, searching for words that balanced honesty with compassion. "Difficult." Emma felt tears she hadn't realized were building begin to blur her vision. The grandmother who had seemed invincible just weeks ago, whose medical uniqueness had made her a beacon of hope for thousands of people, was facing an impossible choice between a dangerous surgery and a slow, inevitable decline. "I need time to think," Dorothy said simply, rising from her chair with the dignity that had carried her through every crisis in her 77 years. "Emma, honey, let's go home." The drive back to Millbrook passed in heavy silence, punctuated only by the sound of Dorothy's steady breathing and the familiar hum of Emma's rental car. The Ohio countryside rolled past, unchanged, indifferent to the medical drama playing out in the vehicle traveling its rural roads. Emma found herself memorizing details of the landscape she'd taken for granted during childhood visits, suddenly aware that this might be among the last times she'd make this journey with her grandmother. That evening, Dorothy surprised Emma by asking her to help retrieve boxes from the basement, the same boxes that had yielded Harold's employment records weeks earlier. But this time, Dorothy was searching for different memories, pulling out photo albums and scrapbooks that chronicled decades of life in the farmhouse. "I want to show you something," Dorothy said, settling beside Emma on the living room couch with a leather-bound album that Emma had never seen before. The pages contained newspaper clippings, letters, and photographs documenting Dorothy's nursing career, but arranged with the care of someone creating a permanent record rather than casual keepsakes. The first section contained thank you letters from patients and their families, spanning 5 decades of grateful correspondence. Emma read with growing amazement as story after story unfolded of lives saved, comfort provided, and hope restored through her grandmother's professional dedication. One letter, dated 1987, was from a woman whose premature twins had survived because of Dorothy's round-the-clock care during a critical period. "Grandma, why have you never shown me these before?" Emma asked, her voice thick with emotion as she continued turning pages filled with evidence of her grandmother's extraordinary impact on others' lives. "I suppose I never thought they were that important," Dorothy replied, though her careful preservation of each item suggested otherwise. "But looking at them now, thinking about what Dr. Mitchell told us today, I'm starting to see my life differently." The second section of the album contained photographs from Dorothy's years working in the hospital's emergency department, images of a younger woman in starched white uniforms, often surrounded by colleagues or patients' families. Emma recognized her grandmother's face in these photos, but saw something she'd never noticed before, a quality of serene competence that seemed to emanate from Dorothy even in the chaos of medical emergencies. "This was taken the night that chemical plant explosion happened over in Warren County," Dorothy said, pointing to a photograph that showed her covered in soot and exhaustion, standing beside an ambulance. 12 workers came in that night, most of them burned pretty badly. I worked a double shift and then stayed another 6 hours because I couldn't leave until I knew they were all stable." Emma studied the photograph, seeing her grandmother not as the elderly woman facing an impossible medical decision, but as the dedicated professional who had spent decades running toward suffering rather than away from it. The woman in the photograph wore the same expression Dorothy had carried into Dr. Mitchell's office that afternoon, calm determination in the face of difficult circumstances. The final section of the album contained items Emma had never seen. Commendation letters from hospital administrators, newspaper articles about medical crises where Dorothy had played crucial roles, and certificates recognizing her contributions to patient care. One article, dated 1995, described Dorothy's role in establishing the hospital's first support program for families of terminally ill patients. "Dorothy Sullivan has an almost supernatural ability to comfort people during their darkest hours," the article quoted the hospital's chief of staff as saying. "She doesn't just provide medical care, she provides hope." Emma closed the album and looked at her grandmother with new understanding. "You're not afraid of the surgery, are you?" Dorothy smiled, the first genuine smile Emma had seen from her since their meeting with Dr. Mitchell. "Honey, I've been facing down scary medical situations for 50 years. What scares me is the thought of all those people who might be helped by what we've learned about my condition, and me not being brave enough to see this through to help them." The realization hit Emma like a physical blow. Her grandmother wasn't weighing personal survival against personal risk. She was calculating her individual life against the potential benefit to thousands of future patients who might suffer from similar chemical exposures. Even facing her own mortality, Dorothy was thinking like a nurse, prioritizing the greater good over personal comfort. The research they're doing, the treatment protocols they might develop, the people who could be saved, that all depends on understanding exactly how this mass works and whether it can be safely removed, Dorothy continued. If I don't take this risk, all of that stops with me. Emma felt the weight of her grandmother's logic and the profound courage it represented. Dorothy wasn't just facing a medical procedure. She was volunteering to be a pioneer in territory where no patient had gone before, accepting personal risk for the sake of advancing medical knowledge that could benefit others. "I'm scared," Emma admitted, the words coming out in a rush of honesty that surprised them both. "So am I, honey," Dorothy replied, pulling Emma close in a hug that felt like both comfort and farewell. "But being scared doesn't mean we don't do what needs to be done. I learned that my first night in the emergency room, and it's served me well ever since." Outside, the Ohio evening settled around the farmhouse with familiar quiet. But inside, grandmother and granddaughter sat together facing the most difficult decision of their lives, knowing that courage had never been about the absence of fear. It had always been about choosing hope, despite being afraid. The surgery was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., chosen deliberately for Dorothy's optimal physiological state and to minimize the media attention that had begun gathering around University Hospital. Emma had spent the previous night in the chair beside her grandmother's hospital bed, watching Dorothy sleep with the peaceful expression of someone who had made peace with uncertainty. At 5:30 a.m., Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway of Dorothy's room, accompanied by Dr. Sarah Chen, the vascular surgeon who would assist with the complex procedure, and Dr. Rebecca Torres, the anesthesiologist whose job would be to keep Dorothy stable throughout what promised to be one of the most challenging operations any of them had attempted. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Mitchell said softly, noting that Dorothy was already awake despite the early hour. "How are you feeling?" "Ready to get this show on the road," Dorothy replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., not from anxiety but from decades of hospital shifts that had trained her body to function on minimal sleep and maximum focus. Emma squeezed her grandmother's hand as the pre-operative team began their final preparations. The surgical suite had been equipped with additional monitoring equipment borrowed from the cardiac surgery department, reflecting the unprecedented nature of Dorothy's case. 3 different surgical teams were standing by in case complications required specialized interventions. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to know that we have contingency plans for every scenario we can anticipate," Dr. Chen explained as they prepared to transport Dorothy to surgery. "The imaging studies have given us detailed maps of the mass's integration with your vascular system, and we've rehearsed this procedure multiple times using surgical simulators." Dorothy nodded, with the understanding of someone who had prepared countless patients for their own surgical journeys. "Doctor, I've been on the other side of this conversation more times than I can count. I know you'll do your best, and that's all anyone can ask." The journey from Dorothy's room to the surgical suite felt both endless and instantaneous to Emma, who walked alongside the gurney holding her grandmother's hand until they reached the restricted area where only medical personnel were allowed. The last thing Dorothy said before the doors closed was, "Tell Harold I'll see him soon, but not too soon." Emma spent the first hour of the surgery in the family waiting room, a space she'd helped design during her medical training but had never experienced from the perspective of an anxious relative. Dr. Hawthorne from the CDC had arrived from Atlanta specifically to await the surgical results, and several researchers from the NIH had gathered in the hospital's conference room to monitor the procedure's progress. At 8:15 a.m., Dr. Mitchell emerged from the surgical suite with an expression Emma couldn't immediately read. His scrubs were stained, and exhaustion lined his face, but something in his eyes suggested cautious optimism rather than defeat. "The mass has been successfully removed," he announced to the assembled group, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just completed one of the most challenging procedures of his career. "Mrs. Sullivan is stable and being transferred to the cardiac intensive care unit for monitoring." Emma felt her knees weaken with relief, but Dr. Mitchell's next words tempered her joy with sobering reality. "However, we encountered complications that we didn't anticipate." The mass wasn't just integrated with her vascular system. It had developed what appeared to be its own blood supply and neural connections. When we removed it, Mrs. Sullivan went into cardiac arrest. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the walls. Emma felt the familiar sensation of medical crisis adrenaline flooding her system, the same response she'd experienced countless times during her own emergency situations. "We were able to resuscitate her successfully, but she suffered what appears to be a mild stroke during the arrest. The extent of any permanent damage won't be clear until she regains consciousness and we can perform neurological assessments." Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward in his chair. "Dr. Mitchell, were you able to preserve the mass intact for research purposes?" "Yes, the entire specimen is being prepared for comprehensive analysis." The preliminary examination during surgery revealed structures that none of us had seen before. Organized cellular arrangements that appeared to be actively filtering her blood and producing protective compounds. Emma absorbed this information with the clinical detachment her medical training had taught her, while simultaneously grappling with the emotional reality that her grandmother's miraculous adaptation might have cost Dorothy her cognitive abilities in the process of being removed. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of medical updates, consultations with specialists, and the peculiar combination of hope and dread that defined hospital waiting rooms. Dorothy remained unconscious in the intensive care unit, surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of her physiological recovery. At 3:47 p.m., nearly 10 hours after the surgery had begun, Dorothy opened her eyes. Emma was alone with her grandmother when it happened, having sent Dr. Mitchell to get coffee after hours of bedside vigil. Dorothy's eyes fluttered open with the confused expression of someone emerging from deep anesthesia, and for a terrifying moment Emma saw no recognition in her grandmother's gaze. "Grandma?" Emma whispered, leaning close to Dorothy's face. "Can you hear me?" Dorothy's lips moved soundlessly for several seconds before her voice emerged as a barely audible whisper. "Emma Grace? What? Where am I?" The flood of relief Emma felt at hearing her grandmother speak coherently was immediately followed by the clinical need to assess Dorothy's neurological function. "You're in the hospital, Grandma. You had surgery this morning. Do you remember?" Dorothy's eyes moved around the intensive care unit with growing awareness, taking in the monitors, IV lines, and medical equipment with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades in similar environments from the other side. "The mass," Dorothy said, her voice growing stronger. Is it gone?" "Yes, Grandma. Dr. Mitchell removed it successfully. You're going to be okay." But even as Emma spoke these reassuring words, she noticed subtle signs that concerned her medical training. Dorothy's speech was slightly slurred, her left hand seemed weaker than her right, and there was a subtle drooping on the left side of her face that suggested the stroke had indeed caused some neurological damage. Dr. Mitchell arrived within minutes of being called, accompanied by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a neurologist who began immediately assessing Dorothy's cognitive and motor functions. The evaluation revealed what Emma had already suspected. Dorothy had suffered a mild stroke that affected her left side motor control and caused some minor speech difficulties. "The good news," Dr. Walsh explained to Dorothy with the kind of straightforward honesty that medical professionals appreciated, is that your cognitive function appears to be intact. You're thinking clearly, your memory is unaffected, and your speech difficulties should improve with therapy. Dorothy listened to this assessment with characteristic pragmatism. So I'll talk a little funny and maybe walk with a limp, but my brain still works? That's exactly right, Dr. Walsh confirmed. Many stroke patients recover significant function with proper rehabilitation, and your overall health gives you excellent prospects for improvement. Emma watched her grandmother process this information, seeing the same analytical approach Dorothy had always applied to medical challenges during her nursing career. Rather than despair over her limitations, Dorothy seemed to be cataloging her remaining abilities and planning how to work around the deficits. "Dr. Mitchell," Dorothy said, turning her attention to the surgeon who had spent 10 hours carefully separating her from the mass that had defined 3 decades of her life. "Was the surgery worth it? Did you learn what you needed to learn?" Mitchell's expression brightened with the enthusiasm of someone whose medical curiosity had been profoundly satisfied. "Mrs. Sullivan, what we found inside that mass is going to change environmental medicine forever. The cellular structures we observed were unlike anything in current medical literature. Your body had essentially created a biological filtration system that was actively protecting you from ongoing chemical toxicity." Dorothy smiled, the expression slightly lopsided due to her stroke-related facial weakness, but unmistakably genuine. "Then it was worth it, even if I have to relearn how to tie my shoes and talk without sounding like I've been drinking Harold's whiskey." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't determine whether they were from relief, admiration, or overwhelming love for the woman who had just risked everything to advance medical knowledge that could help others. Even weakened by surgery and stroke, Dorothy remained focused on the greater good rather than her personal limitations. "There's something else, Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the tone he used for particularly significant announcements. "The tissue analysis has confirmed that your adaptation was successful in ways we never imagined. The mass contained concentrated forms of the exact chemicals from your exposure 30 years ago, but in biologically inert forms. Your body had been systematically neutralizing and storing the toxins, protecting not just you, but potentially anyone who might have been exposed to your bodily fluids." Dorothy absorbed this information with growing amazement. "Are you saying I've been walking around as my own personal hazmat cleanup crew all these years?" "That's actually a remarkably accurate description," Dr. Mitchell replied with a laugh. "Your case is going to provide the foundation for developing treatments that could help thousands of people who've suffered similar chemical exposures." Emma squeezed her grandmother's good hand, feeling the profound weight of Dorothy's sacrifice and its potential impact on countless future patients. The woman who had spent 50 years healing others had literally transformed her own body into a medical breakthrough that could extend her healing influence far beyond anything she'd accomplished during her nursing career. "Harold would be proud," Dorothy whispered, her voice carrying the contentment of someone who had found meaning in suffering and purpose in sacrifice. 6 months after the surgery that had changed everything, Dorothy Mae Sullivan sat in her favorite rocking chair on the farmhouse porch, watching her granddaughter Emma plant tulip bulbs in Harold's garden. The October afternoon carried the crisp promise of winter, but also the deeper promise of spring flowers that would bloom from seeds planted in faith during the darker months. Dorothy's recovery had been nothing short of remarkable, though it hadn't been without its challenges. The stroke-related weakness on her left side had improved significantly through months of physical therapy, and while her speech still carried a slight slur when she was tired, her mind remained as sharp as ever. More importantly, her spirit had been transformed by the knowledge that her decades of silent suffering had yielded discoveries that were already helping others. "Grandma, these tulips are going to be beautiful come spring," Emma called out, brushing soil from her hands as she stood up from the flower bed. She'd moved back to Ohio permanently, establishing a family practice in Millbrook that allowed her to be close to Dorothy while serving the community that had rallied around them both during the medical crisis. The decision to return hadn't been difficult once Emma realized that her grandmother's story had changed her own understanding of what it meant to practice medicine. The high-powered Chicago practice she'd built had focused on efficiency and volume, treating symptoms rather than understanding the whole person behind the illness. Working alongside Dorothy during her recovery had reminded Emma why she'd chosen medicine in the first place. "Harold always said the garden was about hope," Dorothy replied, her voice carrying the contentment of someone who had found peace with life's unexpected turns. "Plant something beautiful in the dark months, trust that spring will come, and be amazed by what grows." The Dorothy Sullivan Center for Environmental Health Research had officially opened 3 months earlier at University Hospital, funded by a combination of NIH grants and private donations that had poured in from across the country once Dorothy's story became public. The research being conducted there had already led to breakthrough treatments for 3 other families affected by the Morrison chemical incident, and inquiries were coming in from industrial accident survivors around the world. Dr. Mitchell had become the center's director, dedicating his career to expanding on the discoveries made possible by Dorothy's unique case. He visited the farmhouse regularly, not just for follow-up medical care, but because Dorothy had become his most trusted consultant on patient care approaches that honored both medical science and human dignity. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have news that I think will interest you," Dr. Mitchell announced as he joined them on the porch that afternoon, carrying a folder thick with documents and photographs. His visits had become a highlight of Dorothy's week, combining medical updates with the kind of collegial consultation she'd missed since retiring from nursing. "The treatment protocol we developed based on your tissue analysis has been successfully tested in clinical trials. We've now helped 47 patients who suffered similar chemical exposures, including 3 children who were showing early signs of the same adaptive responses your body developed." Dorothy leaned forward with the keen interest she'd always shown in medical developments, particularly when they involved helping children. "Tell me about the children, Doctor." Dr. Mitchell opened his folder and showed Dorothy photographs of 3 young patients. A 7-year-old girl from West Virginia whose family had been exposed to contaminated water, a 10-year-old boy from Texas whose father worked in petrochemical processing, and a 12-year-old girl from Louisiana whose neighborhood had been affected by an industrial spill. All 3 were showing early signs of their bodies attempting to develop protective mechanisms similar to yours, but caught early enough that we could intervene with synthetic versions of the compounds your mass was producing. The children are now healthy, with no signs of ongoing toxicity. Emma moved closer to examine the photographs, recognizing in these young faces the future that her grandmother's sacrifice had made possible. "Grandma, you saved these children's lives. Your willingness to undergo that surgery, to let the researchers study your condition, it's already preventing other families from going through what we experienced." Dorothy studied the photographs with the careful attention she'd once given to her own patients, seeing in each young face a victory that justified every moment of fear and uncertainty she'd endured. "What about their families? Are they getting the support they need?" This question was pure Dorothy, Emma thought. Even while celebrating medical breakthroughs, her grandmother's first concern was for the emotional and practical needs of the people behind the medical cases. "That's actually another development I wanted to discuss with you," Dr. Mitchell said, his expression taking on the excitement Emma had learned to associate with his most significant announcements. "The families we've helped have formed a support network, and they've asked if you'd be willing to serve as an honorary advisor. They want to call it the Harold and Dorothy Sullivan Family Support Network." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears at the mention of Harold's name being included in this legacy of healing. "He would have loved that," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Harold always said the hardest part of being sick wasn't the physical symptoms. It was feeling alone and scared." The support network had grown organically from the first families helped by the research protocols derived from Dorothy's case. Parents whose children had been successfully treated began reaching out to newly diagnosed families, offering practical advice and emotional support based on their own experiences. The network now included over 200 families across 15 states, with Dorothy's farmhouse serving as an unofficial headquarters for coordination and encouragement. Emma had watched her grandmother transform from reluctant patient to enthusiastic advocate, using her nursing experience and natural compassion to guide families through the complex medical and emotional challenges of chemical exposure treatment. Dorothy's phone calls with frightened parents had become a regular part of their weekly routine, with her grandmother offering both medical insight and maternal comfort to people facing circumstances she understood better than anyone. "There's one more thing," Dr. Mitchell continued, reaching into his folder for a final document. "The Nobel Committee has announced that this year's prize in physiology or medicine will recognize advances in environmental health research. While you're not eligible as a patient rather than a researcher, the committee has asked if you'd be willing to present the award to the research team, acknowledging your contribution to the discoveries." Dorothy sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of this recognition clearly overwhelming her modest self-perception. Emma felt her own breath catch as she realized her grandmother was being invited to participate in one of the most prestigious ceremonies in medical science. "I don't know what to say," Dorothy finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just did what anyone would do in my situation." "No, Grandma," Emma said firmly, moving to kneel beside Dorothy's rocking chair. "What you did was extraordinary. You chose courage over comfort, knowledge over ignorance, and hope over fear. You turned your suffering into healing for others." The recognition represented something far beyond personal honor. It was acknowledgement that patients themselves could be partners in medical discovery, that the people who lived with conditions were often the key to understanding and treating them. Dorothy's willingness to share her story, undergo dangerous surgery, and dedicate her recovery to helping others had transformed her from patient to pioneer. As autumn deepened into winter, the farmhouse became a gathering place for the extended community that had grown around Dorothy's story. Medical researchers visited regularly to consult on new cases and treatment approaches. Families affected by chemical exposures made pilgrimages to meet the woman whose courage had made their children's recovery possible. Nursing students from the university came to hear Dorothy's stories about the intersection of medical science and human compassion. Emma established a small medical practice in the converted barn behind the farmhouse, creating a space where she could provide primary care to the local community while remaining close to her grandmother. The practice specialized in environmental health concerns, drawing patients from across the Midwest who had heard about the Sullivan family's expertise in chemical exposure effects. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Emma's surprise visit that had started their medical journey, 3 generations of the families helped by Dorothy's research gathered at the farmhouse for a celebration that felt more like a family reunion than a medical conference. Children who might not have survived without the treatment protocols played in Harold's garden while their parents shared stories of recovery and gratitude. Dorothy, now 78 and moving with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to accommodate physical limitations without letting them define her capabilities, moved through the gathering with the serene joy of someone who had discovered that her greatest suffering had produced her most meaningful contribution to the world. "You know what Harold used to say about Christmas?" Dorothy asked Emma as they stood together on the porch, watching children play in the yard where Emma herself had spent countless childhood hours. He said it wasn't about the presence under the tree, it was about the presence in the room. All these families, all these children who are healthy and happy, that's the real gift. Emma squeezed her grandmother's good hand, feeling the profound truth of Harold's wisdom. The farmhouse had always been a place of love and healing, but Dorothy's medical journey had transformed it into something even more significant, a beacon of hope for people facing their darkest medical challenges. "What's next, Grandma?" Emma asked, knowing that Dorothy's active mind was already planning new ways to help others. Dorothy smiled, the expression now perfectly symmetrical thanks to months of recovery, and pointed toward the dormant flower beds where spring bulbs waited beneath the soil. "Same thing Harold's tulips are doing, honey. We rest during the quiet times, we trust in what we can't see yet, and we get ready to bloom when the world needs more beauty." The Nobel ceremony was scheduled for December in Stockholm, where Dorothy would represent not just her own courage, but the countless patients whose willingness to participate in medical research advances human understanding of healing. At 78, the retired nurse from Millbrook, Ohio, was about to take the stage at one of the world's most prestigious scientific gatherings, not as a curiosity, but as a pioneer whose contribution to medicine would benefit generations of patients yet to be born. As the evening settled around the farmhouse filled with grateful families, Dorothy rocked gently in Harold's chair, surrounded by the living proof that love, sacrifice, and hope could indeed change the world one person at a time. Dorothy Sullivan's story reminds us that our greatest challenges often become our most meaningful contributions. At 77, this retired nurse discovered that what she thought was her burden had actually been her body's miraculous way of protecting not just herself, but potentially thousands of others from chemical exposure. For 30 years, she carried shame about a simple bump that turned out to be one of medicine's most important discoveries. How many of us dismiss our own struggles as insignificant, never realizing they might hold the key to helping others? Dorothy's journey from hiding her condition to standing on the Nobel Prize stage proves that our perceived weaknesses can become our greatest strengths. Her granddaughter Emma learned that true healing happens when we stop running from our problems and start embracing our purpose. In Dorothy's own words, "We rest during the quiet times, we trust in what we can't see yet, and we get ready to bloom when the world needs more beauty." Every challenge we've faced, every burden we've carried, every moment we've felt forgotten or overlooked, these experiences haven't been wasted. They've been preparing us to bloom in ways we never imagined possible. What burden in your life might actually be preparing you to help someone else? Have you ever discovered that your greatest struggle became your most meaningful contribution? Share your story in the comments below.